Morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We're going to learn Mishna Pesachim, Parak Hey, chapter 5, Mishna Ches, Mishna 8. Okay. K'ma'aseo b'chol, the same way things were done during the week, kach ma'aseo b'Shabbos. So too was done on Shabbos, meaning everything we set up until now about the slaughtering and the Kohanim passing things on and sprinkling the blood, and the saying of Hallel, all those things were done on Shabbos just as they were done during the week. That does not mean that we're not going to learn in the future things that were only done during the week and not done on Shabbos. But right now, everything we discussed until now, just as it was done during the week, it was done on Shabbos. Ella, with the exception being, Shakohanim adichem es azara, that the Kohanim used to rinse the floor of the Azara, of the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, Shaloi Keretzayin Chachamim, which was against the will, against the desire or the wishes of the Chachamim. So there was this, what went on Shabbos, meaning this went on during the week and it went on Shabbos. Just that when they did it on Shabbos, the Chachamim, the sages, were not pleased with what the Kohanim were doing. The Kohanim were rinsing the floor on Shabbos. Now, first of all, how did they rinse the floor? So the answer is that there was this canal running through the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash of the temple, and it exited through an opening in the wall. And to clean the marble floor of the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, they used to stop up the canal so the water would flow over to the sides. The water would then, pick up all the blood, and then they would open up the canal and it would all rinse out. That's how they did it. That's how they typically, when the blood would accumulate, this is what they would do to rinse off the floor of the Azara, which again, that was happening. They were throwing the blood against the wall of the Mizbech, of the altar. It was dripping down and eventually hit the floor. And there was a lot of karbanas, a lot of sacrifice being offered. So at a certain point, they would, again, stop up the canal, let the water flow over, fill up the floor, picking up the blood, and then let it out. So that was something the Kohanim did on Shabbos. The Chachamim were not pleased with that. Now, what was the problem? The problem is like this. I'm going to read it to you. The rabbis permitted washing or sweeping a floor on Shabbos in general. Okay, there's a certain general prohibition of washing or sweeping a floor on Shabbos out of concern that one might clean a dirt floor and in the process smooth out its uneven sections, which are biblically forbidden on Shabbos. If you have a dirt floor and you're cleaning it off and you're sweeping it, so if it comes out that you even out an uneven section, that is considered on Shabbos bona building, and that's prohibited. And therefore, the Chachamim said, not only can you, so therefore, in order to prevent people from doing that, they prohibited washing or sweeping any kind of floor on Shabbos. Now, we'll talk about that soon, but right now, let's just start from that point. That point is there is a prohibition of sweeping or washing the floor on Shabbos. The Kohanim nevertheless cleaned the temple floor, even though there was such a prohibition, because as a rule, rabbinic restrictions on Shabbos activity do not apply in the Beis HaMikdash. Ein shvus b'mikdash. The rabbinic prohibitions do not apply in the Beis HaMikdash. If they don't apply in the Beis HaMikdash, then there should be no problem cleaning the floor. The sages, however, were not pleased with this because restrictions are lifted in the Beis HaMikdash only when necessary for the avodah. Rinsing the floor after the avodah is not necessary for the avodah and is therefore forbidden. Yes, it's true. Ein shvus b'mikdash. Rabbinic prohibitions don't apply to the Beis HaMikdash. But that's only when the rabbinic prohibitions are going to be in the way of something that we call the avodah. So it's involved in what's called the worship. It's involved. It gets into the if it prevents us from being able to do the avodah, the worship in the Beis HaMikdash, then those rabbinic prohibitions were lifted. But cleaning the floor was not in any way part of the. It wasn't necessary for the avodah. It was just about making the place cleaner and, more respectable. But that was not part of the avodah. Was it necessary for the worship in the Beis HaMikdash, for the service in the Beis HaMikdash? And therefore, the Chachamim said you can't do it. So we basically had here a machlokes, an argument between the Kohanim and the rest of the sages. Mm-hmm. The Kohanim held that no restrictions in the Beis HaMikdash, or no rabbinic restrictions in the Beis HaMikdash, so they can clean the floor. And the Chachamim said the lifting of rabbinic prohibitions in the Beis HaMikdash only apply to things that are necessary for the avodah, for the service in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, They also add here in the notes, the prohibition to wash or sweep floors applied only in times and places when most people had dirt floors, and not to non-dirt floors nowadays when most floors are covered with wood or other materials. Meaning, is there a problem with sweeping a floor now on Shabbos? If it's a dirt floor, yes. If it's not a dirt floor, then we say you're allowed to, because the prohibition of sweeping a non-dirt floor where there isn't the actual problem of evening out, uneven areas, that only applied at a time when most people had dirt floors, and your floor is a different floor, so we say you can't clean your floor either. But when most floors aren't dirt floors, then there is no prohibition about sweeping or cleaning a non-dirt floor. Okay, Mishnah continues. This next part of the Mishnah has nothing to do with Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda says, the Kohen would fill up a cup from the mixed blood. Mixed blood means, we're talking about here, there are many sacrifices that were offered, right? And you have the Kohanim passing the bowl with the blood, and the Kohen would take the blood at the end of the line next to the altar, next to the Mizbeach, throw it on the wall, right? This was done hundreds and hundreds of times for everybody that was there. Okay, so the Mishnah says, so as we said before, we had this whole discussion about cleaning the floor from the blood, but there's clearly blood on the floor. So it says a Kohen would take a cup, fill up from that blood on the floor that is considered a mixture of all the bloods of all the karbanos that were slaughtered that day for the Karban Pesach. And it would throw it once on the altar. The did not agree to this. Now, the issue here is like this. The issue here is that if, let's say, it comes out, there was an awful lot of, passing blood and a lot of activity going on. If it came out that during that period of time, one of those bowls of blood spilled and never reached the Mizbeach, then that carbon that it came from, that sacrifice that it came from, is not valid. It's no good. So in order to, the question was, is there something we can do in case that did happen? Is there something we can do to rectify that? So according to Rabbi Yehuda, the solution is like this. Since, and I'm going to read to you, this is the first part of to understand this. Since blood is a liquid substance, we assume that in any area in which it is contained, it all mixes together evenly. That's an assumption that we make in halacha. You've got all this blood here in this area, then we say that all the blood mixes evenly. Therefore, a cup of blood from the floor is assumed to contain at least a drop of blood from every animal whose blood spilled there. So therefore, when I scoop up this cup, there is a drop of blood from every carbon there. So now, what do? Throw it on the Mizbeach, and in case any carbon's blood got spilled and didn't get thrown onto the Mizbeach's wall, now it did. Mm-hmm. That was Rabbi Yehuda said they did. But the Chachamim said, no, it's not going to work. It's not going to work because once it's on the floor, you can't scoop it up anymore and throw it onto the wall. Why is that? So again, the sage, I'm going to read to you for this. The sages hold that the blood on the floor cannot be used to fulfill the obligation of throwing the blood for the following reason. Number one, the blood that must be thrown on the Mizbeach, on the altar, is what's called dam hanefesh, the lifeblood of the animal. That is the blood that spurts from an animal's neck as soon as it is slaughtered. That's the blood that gets sprinkled on the wall of the altar. Most of the lifeblood from the Pesach offerings was received in vessels and thrown on the altar. Consequently, the majority of blood on the floor is blood that drained from the animals after spurting stopped, which is called dam hatamtzis. Okay, most of the blood on the floor is blood that keeps coming out, but not that first spurt that comes out when it's slaughtered. This blood is unfit for throwing on the altar. You can only use that first blood that spurts for zrika, for throwing the blood on the altar wall. The sages therefore apply now. Okay, so that's step number one. Step number one is the majority of the blood on the floor is not dam hanefesh, not the lifeblood. some lifeblood can be in there, but the majority is not the lifeblood. The majority is the blood that comes out after that, which is blood that is not valid for throwing on the Mizbeach. Now,
and that invalidates even...
1 second.
That invalidates even the fact that there is...
Now, yeah, hold on. The sages therefore apply the principle of bittul b'roiv, nullification by the majority, which states that when two substances are mixed, the majority substance cancels out the minority one. That's called bittul, nullification. It basically, the minority loses its identity. It's like it's not there anymore, or it loses its identity. Thus, the small amount of lifeblood on the floor is canceled out by the larger amount of unsuitable blood. And the blood on the floor is not fit to be thrown on the altar. That is what the Chachamim said. The minority of lifeblood becomes nullified or canceled out in the majority of the blood that comes after that. It's nullified in the majority of blood that cannot be used on the Mizbeach, and therefore you can't sprinkle this blood. Now Rabbi Yehuda didn't have this problem. Rabbi Yehuda says you could. Why is that? Rabbi Yehuda, though, maintains that the principle of nullification is not applied to two substances that are alike. Min b'minoi, it's called. When two substances are alike, they do not become, the nullification doesn't take place. Therefore, one type of blood cannot cancel out another type of blood. The two are the same thing. That's the rule by bittul, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Min b'minoi ein batul. If they're two of the same type of thing, they cannot, there is no nullification that takes place. And therefore, whatever lifeblood is on the floor thus retains its identity and can be thrown on the altar. Because as long as I have some lifeblood in this, I can assume that the lifeblood in this is a mixture of some of the blood of all the karbanos, and therefore, at the end of the day, since it's not nullified, I can throw it on the altar and cover any of the sacrifices whose blood was not until now sprinkled on the mizbeach, and everything will be kosher. That's the machlokes of the Chachamim Yehuda as to whether this was an option of scooping up some of the blood from the floor and then sprinkling it on the mizbeach. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And so